There's something haunting about the name Nietzsche. It echoes through the corridors of modern thought like a whisper both feared and revered. To some, he was a prophet of human liberation, a firebrand who dared to question the very scaffolding of morality, religion, and tradition. To others, he became a cautionary tale, the man whose words, though brilliant, were later twisted into ideological weapons. And therein lies the enigma. Friedrich Nietzsche was never an easy philosopher to pin down. He didn't write manifestos or hand out blueprints for society. Instead, he scattered fragments of soul, paradox, and provocation, challenging us to confront the raw essence of power, truth, and the self. But among his most infamous ideas lies one that continues to spark both admiration and alarm: the will to power, a concept so rich, so protean, that it has been read as everything from a call to creativity to a justification for domination. And that brings us to a question that refuses to be silenced. Did Nietzsche's philosophy, especially his notion of the will to power, somehow feed into the violent rise of fascist ideologies in the 20th century? Was he, however unwillingly, a spiritual ancestor to regimes that worshipped strength, hierarchy, and control? This is more than a historical curiosity. It's a philosophical reckoning. Because if the seeds of authoritarianism can be hidden within the soil of high-minded thought, then understanding that shadow becomes a matter not just of intellect, but of conscience. Over the course of this exploration, we'll trace Nietzsche's life and ideas within the world that shaped him, examine how his concepts were both misunderstood and manipulated, and ultimately ask whether it was Nietzsche's philosophy itself, or the world's refusal to read him deeply, that gave rise to the darker uses of his name. And as we journey deeper, we may find that the real danger wasn't what Nietzsche said, but how the world chose to hear him. To understand Nietzsche, we have to begin not with what he said, but with the world he was saying it to. Late 19th century Europe was a continent caught between two eras. The certainties of faith, empire, and tradition were crumbling. Science was dismantling long-held beliefs, and industrialization was reshaping the very rhythm of life. Beneath it all, a deeper crisis was quietly unfolding: the crisis of values. What happens, Nietzsche asked, when the foundations of meaning collapse? When the stories we've told ourselves about God, about morality, about progress, begin to unravel? This wasn't just a cultural observation. It was a spiritual alarm. Nietzsche named it nihilism, the creeping sense that life, stripped of transcendent anchors, might ultimately be meaningless. But rather than mourn this loss, Nietzsche challenged humanity to rise through it. His was a call not to despair, but to transformation. Enter some of his most provocative ideas: the death of God, not as a celebration, but as a recognition of loss; the critique of herd morality, our tendency to follow the crowd, even at the cost of our own truth; the exaltation of individualism, not selfishness, but the fierce courage to shape one's own soul; and the vision of the Übermensch, the overman, not a tyrant, but a human being who has transcended fear, conformity, and resentment. And here's where it becomes especially important. Nietzsche stood fiercely against the very ideologies that would later claim him. He despised nationalism, abhorred antisemitism, and mocked state control as a form of spiritual cowardice. He didn't belong to the left or the right. He distrusted mass movements and ideological purity in equal measure. In a world leaning into both liberal optimism and authoritarian control, Nietzsche stood alone, against the tide, insisting that the only true revolution was within. It's from this deeply personal, deeply radical place that his idea of the will to power emerges. Not as a political slogan, but as a philosophical cry. And yet, it is precisely this idea that would later be pulled, distorted, and repurposed in ways Nietzsche never imagined. If there's one phrase most closely tied to Nietzsche's name, it's this: the will to power. And yet, ironically, it's also one of his most misunderstood and most misused ideas. Nietzsche never published a book called The Will to Power. What we have instead are fragments, notes, sketches, thoughts scribbled in margins and notebooks. It was meant to be part of a larger project, something alive and evolving. But Nietzsche never completed it. What survives is a constellation of ideas, not a doctrine. And yet, after his death, those unpublished writings were gathered and shaped into a book called The Will to Power, by his sister, Elizabeth Förster-Nietzsche, whose own political leanings would cast a long shadow over her brother's legacy. But more on that soon. So, what did Nietzsche actually mean by the will to power? At its heart, it's not about domination, conquest, or brute strength. It's not about nations waging war or men seizing thrones. Nietzsche's will to power is something deeper, something existential. It's the fundamental force that drives all life. Not to survive, but to express, to grow, to transcend. For Nietzsche, power wasn't about control over others. It was about mastery of the self. The will to power is the creative engine behind art, love, philosophy, transformation. It is the force that compels us to become more than what we are, to break through limitations, to rise beyond fear, to affirm life in all its contradictions. It's a metaphysical idea, yes, but also an emotional one. Because Nietzsche didn't believe in passive existence. He believed in becoming, in dancing with chaos and shaping it into something meaningful, in saying yes to life, even when it hurts. And yet, this nuance was often lost, especially when his private notes, the Nachlass, were later edited with ideological intentions. Elizabeth, loyal to her own nationalist and anti-Semitic beliefs, had a vested interest in presenting Nietzsche as something he was not, a prophet of power in the narrow, authoritarian sense. Her editorial hand turned fragments into dogma and philosophical musings into political fodder. It was through her influence that the will to power began to look less like a personal striving and more like a justification for control. But Nietzsche's vision was never about power over others. It was about the fierce, sacred responsibility of shaping one's own destiny. And the tragedy is, once this idea was stripped of its soul, it became vulnerable to misuse, especially by those who sought power not to create, but to dominate. When Friedrich Nietzsche fell into mental collapse in 1889, his voice, so full of fire and fury, went silent. He would live for another 11 years, but the words that came after were no longer his. And it was in that silence that the myth began to grow. Enter Elizabeth Förster-Nietzsche, his sister, caretaker, and eventual literary executor. To understand how Nietzsche's philosophy became entangled with dangerous ideologies, we must understand her role. Elizabeth was not just a family member. She was a staunch nationalist, an admirer of authoritarian politics, and a sympathizer of early fascist movements. Her worldview could not have been more different from her brother's. After his collapse, Elizabeth took control of Nietzsche's unpublished writings, his notebooks, letters, scraps of thought, and began shaping his legacy. With no formal training in philosophy, but a clear political agenda, she edited and reassembled these writings into a book she titled The Will to Power. But this was no faithful collection. She selected passages that fit her worldview, removed others, and sometimes even altered the wording. The result was a Frankenstein's version of Nietzsche, a thinker now stripped of nuance and made to sound like a prophet of domination and state power. Through the Nietzsche archive, which she founded and controlled, this distorted image spread. Readers across Europe encountered a Nietzsche who seemed to endorse hierarchy, aggression, even racial superiority. The tragedy is that many never questioned it. They didn't see the manipulation behind the curtain. They simply read the words and assumed they reflected Nietzsche's intent. This version of Nietzsche, curated through Elizabeth's lens, was the one later quoted by fascist leaders and ideologues. It offered a false philosophical backbone to violent political movements. But what it didn't offer was truth. And so, the world inherited not just Nietzsche's philosophy, but the myth built around it. A myth powerful enough to shape history, but fragile enough to unravel when examined with care. As we move forward, we'll see why Nietzsche's work was so appealing to ideologues in search of intellectual legitimacy, and how his voice, once misrepresented, became a tool for a world he had never wished to create. In the wake of World War I, Europe found itself in a spiritual and philosophical wasteland. The Enlightenment promises, reason, progress, civilization, had led not to utopia, but to trenches, gas, and unspeakable loss. Faith in liberal democracy wavered. Old monarchies had crumbled, and the church's moral grip no longer held sway. In that void, people began to look elsewhere for meaning, something primal, something powerful, something that felt less like reason and more like force. It was in this crisis of meaning that fascism began to rise. Fascist leaders, hungry for legitimacy, turned to philosophy, but not to engage with it honestly. They raided it like looters in a sacred library, lifting phrases, symbols, and half-formed ideas that could be repurposed to justify their ideology. Nietzsche's work, already shrouded in myth thanks to Elizabeth's distortions, became an easy target. The Übermensch, for instance, originally imagined by Nietzsche as a symbol of radical individual transformation, was stripped of its complexity and turned into a racialized ideal, a blueprint for a master race. The will to power, a metaphysical drive toward self-overcoming, was reduced to a slogan of brute dominance and military conquest. These ideas were no longer philosophical provocations. They became propaganda tools. Benito Mussolini, himself a former socialist turned fascist architect, referenced Nietzsche as a guiding influence. In Germany, the Nazi regime promoted the philosopher as a prophet of strength and Aryan superiority. His books were circulated. His name was invoked. But the Nietzsche they claimed was not the one who denounced nationalism, or who ridiculed antisemitism, or who feared the rise of mass movements. It was a Nietzsche curated by power, hollowed out and refilled with ideology. And yet, even in this grim appropriation, something strange lingers. Nietzsche himself had warned us of the herd, of blind obedience, of those who would use philosophy to escape the hard work of thinking. It was not Nietzsche who failed. It was the world that failed to read him rightly. In the next part of our journey, we'll explore the contradiction that followed, how the Nazis both embraced and misunderstood him, and how Nietzsche became a pawn in a game he never agreed to play. By the time the Nazis rose to power in the 1930s, Nietzsche's name was already wrapped in contradiction. On one hand, he was heralded as a prophet of German greatness, a philosopher who spoke of strength, power, and overcoming weakness. On the other hand, to read Nietzsche honestly was to confront a mind utterly at odds with the authoritarianism that gripped the nation. And yet, the regime pressed on, eager to make Nietzsche part of its cultural scaffolding. Enter Alfred Bäumler, a philosopher and staunch Nazi ideologue. Bäumler played a pivotal role in shaping Nietzsche's image within the Third Reich. He presented Nietzsche as a precursor to National Socialism, a thinker who, in Bäumler's telling, had laid the philosophical groundwork for the Nazi worldview. Under his influence, Nietzsche became a symbol of strength, hierarchy, and ruthless vitality. The will to power was interpreted as a call to dominate. The Übermensch became a racial archetype, and Nietzsche's fierce rejection of herd morality was spun as a rejection of democracy in favor of fascist order. But this was never the Nietzsche who lived and wrote. The real Nietzsche despised the kind of nationalism that the Nazis glorified. He called antisemitism the sign of a weak mind, and broke ties with colleagues and family over their anti-Semitic beliefs. He warned repeatedly against the dangers of collective identity, the seduction of blind obedience, and the soul-crushing machinery of the modern state. Contemporary thinkers and writers saw through the regime's shallow appropriation. Thomas Mann, the Nobel Prize-winning author, called the Nazi use of Nietzsche a shameless misreading. Karl Jaspers, a close reader and admirer of Nietzsche, worked tirelessly after the war to separate the philosopher's thought from the ideology that had stolen it. These voices reminded the world that Nietzsche's work was not a blueprint for tyranny. It was a challenge to it. In truth, Nietzsche was too anarchic, too unruly, too deeply individual to ever be fully claimed by any political system, least of all one that demanded obedience over inquiry, uniformity over authenticity. But the damage had been done. The name Nietzsche now carried associations it never earned. And for decades to come, philosophers and readers alike would be left to untangle the truth from the propaganda. Next, we'll turn to those who picked up that task and began the slow work of restoring Nietzsche's voice from the shadows history cast over it. After the fall of the Third Reich, Nietzsche's legacy stood at a crossroads. His name had been invoked by tyrants, his words twisted into justification for horrors he never condoned. But there were those who refused to let that be the final chapter. In the years that followed World War II, a group of scholars began the patient work of reclamation. Chief among them were Walter Kaufmann and R.J. Hollingdale, two thinkers who saw through the propaganda and reached back to Nietzsche himself. Kaufmann especially transformed the way the English-speaking world understood Nietzsche. His translations were not only more accurate, they were infused with a deep respect for the subtlety, irony, and humanity in Nietzsche's voice. Hollingdale followed suit, offering fresh readings that highlighted Nietzsche's psychological insight, his literary brilliance, and his unrelenting honesty. Together, they stripped away the false armor placed upon him by fascist ideology and revealed something much more complex and more human. Academic philosophy soon followed. Nietzsche was no longer seen as a proto-fascist, but as a prophetic figure who had anticipated the 20th century's existential crises. He became a forefather to existentialism, with thinkers like Sartre and Camus acknowledging his influence. Later, post-structuralists like Michel Foucault and Gilles Deleuze embraced Nietzsche's critique of power, not as domination, but as a force that shapes truth, identity, and resistance. Even Hannah Arendt, in her Meditations on Totalitarianism, drew from Nietzsche's warnings about the loss of individuality and the seductive pull of collective ideology. Nietzsche, once claimed by tyranny, was now becoming a philosopher of liberation. But even with these reevaluations, one question still lingered, one that invites us all to look inward. Was Nietzsche dangerous because of what he said, or because of what others needed him to say? And that's where we turn next, to the heart of this dilemma and the delicate balance between thought and interpretation. So, did Nietzsche's ideas truly influence fascism? Or were they simply co-opted, twisted into something he never meant, something he would have fiercely rejected? The answer, as with all things Nietzsche, resists simplicity. Nietzsche's philosophy is not a static system. It's a provocation, a mirror, a challenge hurled at the soul. His ideas are layered, contradictory, sometimes poetic, sometimes razor-sharp. They demand that we think, not follow, that we wrestle, not surrender. So when these ideas were extracted from their context, stripped of nuance and repackaged as political slogans, they became something else entirely. Not philosophy, but ideology. Not questions, but answers meant to control. And that's the real danger, isn't it? Not in what a philosopher writes, but in how the world decides to use their words. When ideas are decontextualized, weaponized, and fed into the machinery of power, we lose the heart of philosophy itself. We trade complexity for certainty, doubt for dogma. Nietzsche warned us about this. He knew that truth is fragile, that meaning is dangerous in the wrong hands. And perhaps that's why his work still matters, because it reminds us not only to think, but to think deeply, to resist easy narratives, to read not just with our minds, but with our integrity. In the end, Nietzsche's legacy isn't defined by what was done in his name. It's defined by how we choose to engage with him today. with care, with courage, with the willingness to see him not as a symbol, but as a soul wrestling with the hardest truths of all.